The city hummed with a sound entirely unfamiliar to Elena's ears. It was a different kind of busy than her beloved Chicago. Back home, the noise was a loud, brash symphony of car horns, shouted conversations, and the deep rumble of the L train. Here, the sound was like a constant low murmur, a stream of a language she couldn't yet understand, punctuated by the gentle swish of passing cars and the distant chime from a storefront. She felt the loneliness wrap around her shoulders like a thin, chilly blanket, even in the mild afternoon air. She had been in Seoul for 2 weeks, and the initial excitement of a new job, a new country, had faded into a stark reality of missed connections and quiet evenings in her small apartment. Everything was new, and while new was exciting, it was also incredibly isolating. Her feet seemed to carry her on their own, a homing instinct for a feeling of comfort. That's when she saw it tucked between a brightly lit cosmetic store and a restaurant with sizzling sounds emanating from within. A bookstore, but not just any bookstore. The window display was filled with familiar names. The title spelled out in the comforting curves of the English alphabet. The English Nook. The sign above the door read. It was a beacon. Pushing the door open, a little bell jingled softly overhead, and the smell of old paper and fresh coffee washed over her. It was a smell that knew no country. Smelled like home. The inside was cozy with shelves that reached high up to the ceiling and worn, comfortable armchairs tucked into corners. It was quiet, save for the soft turning of a page from an elderly man in one of the chairs. Elena wandered through the aisles, her fingers gently trailing along the spines of the books. She was looking for a specific one, her favorite romance novel she'd read a dozen times, the one she turned to when she needed to feel like a happy ending was possible. She found the section, her eyes scanning the titles, moving higher and higher. There it was on the very top shelf, just out of her comfortable reach. She stretched her arms, standing on her tiptoes, but her fingertips only brushed against the dusty bottom of the book's spine. A small sigh of frustration escaped her lips. It figured even the simple comfort of a familiar book was being kept from her. "Let me help you," a voice said, quiet and gentle from behind her right shoulder. She turned a little startled. Standing there was a young man. He had dark, kind eyes and hair that fell softly across his forehead. He wasn't overly tall, but he was certainly tall enough to solve her problem. He gave her a small, shy smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle slightly. Without waiting for an answer, he easily reached up, his long fingers carefully plucking the very book she was reaching for from its high perch. He held it out to her. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice a bit breathless from the surprise. "My pride was taking a beating." He chuckled, a warm, pleasant sound. "This shelf is a pride eater for almost everyone. I think the owner does it on purpose." He glanced at the book's cover. "This is a good one, a classic. You've read it?" Elena asked, surprised. She took the book, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. "A long time ago," he said. "My name is David." "I'm Elena." They stood there for a moment in a slightly awkward but not unpleasant silence. David shifted his weight. "Are you new to the city? I haven't seen you in here before." "I just moved from Chicago for work. I teach English." Elena found the words tumbling out more easily than they had with anyone else in weeks. "This place, it's the first thing that's felt normal." David's face lit up with understanding. "I know that feeling. I spent a year studying in Boston. I lived in a used bookstore for the first month. It was my safe place." He pointed to a different shelf. "The owner here has a great collection of art books and graphic novels, too. That's more my area. I'm a concept artist for video games." They began to walk slowly through the aisles. As they talked, David showed her a section with beautiful books filled with paintings and sketches of fantasy worlds, explaining his job. Elena talked about her students back in Chicago and her new class here. The conversation flowed easily like a river finding its natural path. The loneliness that had clung to Elena began to melt away, replaced by a warm, glowing feeling of connection. They talked about favorite foods, the best places to see the city lights, and the strange difficulty of finding good peanut butter in Seoul. They talked until the sun began to set, casting long orange beams through the front window of the shop. Elena realized with a start how much time had passed. "Oh, I had no idea it was so late. I should probably let you go." "No, it's okay," David said quickly, a hint of disappointment in his eyes. "It was really nice talking to you." "It was nice talking to you too, David." Thank you again for the rescue. She held up the book and smiled. As she turned to walk towards the cashier, David suddenly said, "Wait." He rummaged in the small bag he was carrying, pulling out a sketchbook and a pencil. He tore a small corner from a blank page, scribbled something on it, and hurried after her. He held out the tiny piece of paper, his ears turning a distinct shade of pink. "In case you ever want a tour guide, or just someone to talk to about non-book-related things." Elena took the paper. Anna was his name and a phone number. Her heart did a little flip. "I'd like that," she said softly. She paid for her book and walked out of the store, the little bell jingling a cheerful goodbye. The city sounds outside no longer felt like a muffling blanket, but like the background music to a new adventure. She clutched the book in one hand and the small piece of paper in the other, holding on tightly as she walked down the street, a genuine, hopeful smile finally gracing her face. The evening air didn't feel chilly anymore. It felt full of promise. The little piece of paper with David's number felt like a live wire in the pocket of Elena's jeans. For 2 whole days, she carried it with her everywhere, taking it out and smoothing it flat on her kitchen table, looking at the neat, precise numbers. The bravery she felt in the bookstore had faded, replaced by a nervous flutter in her stomach. What if he was just being polite? What if she called and he didn't remember her? The fear of rejection was a cold, heavy weight. Finally, on the 3rd evening, sitting cross-legged on her floor with a bowl of uneaten noodles in front of her, she picked up her phone. She typed a simple message, her thumbs clumsy and hesitant. "Hi, David, it's Elena from the bookstore." She hit send before she could change her mind, and immediately threw her phone onto the couch as if it were suddenly hot to the touch. It buzzed less than a minute later. His reply was warm and immediate, filled with a smiling emoji and a question about her week. The flutter in her stomach turned into a warm, spreading glow. Their first official date was at a sprawling weekend market, a chaotic and wonderful place David insisted she had to see. He was a perfect guide, patient and knowledgeable, pointing out things she would have never noticed on her own. He bought her a hot sweet pastry filled with red bean paste, watching her face with an amused smile as she took her first surprised bite. "It's not a Chicago deep dish pizza," he said with a laugh, "but it's a good start." They walked for hours past stalls selling everything from live octopus to handmade pottery. The noise of the crowd, a comfortable buffer that made talking easy. Elena found herself laughing more than she had in months, the sound feeling foreign and wonderful in her own ears. David was different away from the quiet of the bookstore. He was funnier, more animated, his eyes lighting up when he explained the history behind a certain food or the meaning of a traditional craft. When he casually took her hand to guide her through a particularly dense crowd, his palm was warm and sure, and he didn't let go even once they were through. Elena felt a jolt, a simple electric connection that started in her hand and traveled all the way up her arm, settling deep in her chest. The dates that followed painted a new, brighter picture of the city for Elena. It was no longer a place of lonely anonymity, but a canvas for their growing connection. They spent a drizzly afternoon in a massive art museum, speaking in hushed tones in front of dramatic ancient landscapes. David would stand for a long time before certain paintings, his head tilted, and he would whisper to her about the artist's use of light and shadow, his passion for art evident in every soft-spoken word. On a sun-drenched day, they took a long walk along the old city wall, the ancient stonework winding through a modern park. They found a quiet bench overlooking the sprawling metropolis below, the cityscape, a jagged, beautiful silhouette against the setting sun. It was there in the quiet golden light of the evening that the conversation turned inward, shedding its light, easy skin. David talked about the pressure he felt from his family, their quiet expectations for his life, their subtle disappointment that his career in games wasn't something more traditional, like being a doctor or an engineer. He spoke of his own fears of not being good enough, of his art one day failing him. It was a vulnerability Elena hadn't seen in him before, and it made her feel trusted. The city lights began to twinkle on below them, one by one, like stars coming out to listen. Emboldened by his honesty, Elena took a deep, shaky breath. The hum of the city seemed to fade into a distant whisper. I've never done this before," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. She didn't look at him, instead focusing on a single bright light far off in the distance. "I mean, I've dated a little, but I've never been in love. Not even close. The whole idea of it kind of terrifies me." She finally chanced to glance at him, expecting to see pity or worse, amusement, but his face was soft, his expression completely serious and attentive. "I'm always so scared of getting it wrong," she continued, her words tumbling out now. "Of getting my heart completely broken." David was silent for a long moment, simply looking at her. He then slowly reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His touch was grounding. "Elena," he said, his voice firm and gentle all at once. "Your heart is safe with me. We can go as slow as you need. There is no wrong way to do this. Every single step with you, whether it's just holding your hand like this or getting to hear you laugh, feels special to me." The words were so simple, so direct, and they washed over Elena, dissolving the cold knot of fear that had lived inside her for so long. No one had ever said anything like that to her. He wasn't promising her a fairy tale. He was promising her patience. He was promising her safety. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. A new layer of comfort settled over them after that night. The touches became more frequent, more intentional. A hug when they greeted each other lasted a few seconds longer, becoming a true embrace where she could rest her head against his shoulder and feel the solid, steady beat of his heart. A goodbye kiss on the cheek one evening, soft and fleeting, made her skin tingle for hours afterward. The air between them seemed to crackle with a new acknowledged energy, a silent conversation of wanting and waiting. The shift culminated on a Friday night at his apartment. It was the first time she had seen where he lived. It was surprisingly tidy, dominated by a large desk with 2 computer monitors covered in breathtaking digital landscapes and sketches of fantasy characters. The rest of the space was filled with books, plants, and the comfortable clutter of a life lived creatively. They ordered food, and it arrived in a multitude of small boxes and containers, covering his low coffee table in a feast of colors and smells. They ate sitting on cushions on the floor, talking and laughing, their knees touching. After they finished, David put on some soft instrumental music and they cleaned up together, moving around his small kitchen in an easy, synchronized dance. Later, they sat on his couch side by side, looking through one of his physical sketchbooks. He was shy about it at first, but Elena insisted, and he slowly turned the pages showing her drawings from his childhood, from his time in Boston, and recent quick sketches of city scenes. Then he turned a page, and Elena's breath caught. It was her. It was a detailed, beautifully shaded pencil drawing of her profile, her head slightly tilted, a small smile on her lips. It was the face she saw in the mirror, but seen through his eyes. Softer, more thoughtful, more beautiful. "David," she whispered, her eyes suddenly stinging with tears. "When did you?" "After our second date," he admitted, his voice low. "I couldn't get your face out of my head. I had to try and capture it." He looked genuinely nervous, searching her face for her reaction. In that moment, any last remaining wall around Elena's heart crumbled to dust. She reached out and cupped his face, her thumb gently stroking his cheek. She leaned in and kissed him. It started soft and slow, a tender exploration. But then something shifted. The careful patience they had practiced melted away in the heat of the moment, replaced by a wave of pure, unspoken desire that had been building for weeks. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more passionate. It was a conversation without words, full of everything they had been too shy or too scared to say aloud. His hands came up to cradle her face, then slid into her hair, pulling her closer. Her own hands fisted in the soft fabric of his shirt, holding on as if she might float away. The sketchbook tumbled, forgotten to the floor. The world outside his windows, the entire city of Seoul, ceased to exist. There was only the feel of his lips on hers, the sound of their ragged breathing, the overwhelming sense of rightness. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own dark and full of a silent question. In answer she stood, taking his hand and leading him from the couch. The journey to his bedroom was a blur of soft touches and whispered names. What followed was not a frantic rush, but a slow, deliberate discovery. It was a night of firsts for Elena, not just of physical intimacy, but of a profound emotional nakedness. In the quiet dark, with only the city's glow filtering through the blinds, there was no fear, no hesitation. There was only David's gentle hands, his reverent whispers against her skin, and the breathtaking feeling of being truly, completely seen and cherished. It was not just two bodies coming together. It was two souls finally fully choosing to trust each other with everything they were. Later, as she lay curled against his side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat slow to a calm, sleeping pace, she knew this was what all the songs and books were about. This was the thing that was worth being brave for. The golden period that followed felt like a dream from which Elena never wanted to wake. The city of Seoul, once a landscape of lonely echoes, had been completely remade. Its streets were now a map of their shared memories. The bench on Namsan Mountain was where they had shared their first real kiss under a blanket of stars. The tiny hidden dumpling shop in a back alley was their spot. The Mrs. Kim who ran it always greeting them with a wide gap-toed smile and an extra serving of kimchi. David's apartment was no longer just his. It was theirs, a sanctuary filled with the mingled scents of his charcoal pencils and her favorite vanilla-scented candle. They had built a beautiful, bustling life in the heart of South Korea. A life woven together from shared meals, late-night conversations, and the deep abiding peace that comes from being wholly known and accepted by another person. Elena's one-year teaching contract, which had once seemed like an eternity, now felt like a sand timer draining with alarming speed. The future, which had been a hazy, distant concept, began to sharpen into a pressing, unavoidable reality. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, stark and official in her inbox. It was the offer from a prestigious private school in Chicago, the kind of opportunity she had worked towards for years. It was a fantastic position with a salary and benefits that were undeniably a step up in her career. It was everything she had thought she wanted before she had known what it was like to have her hand held by David on a crowded subway or to wake up to the sound of his soft breathing beside her. The excitement that should have bubbled up at the sight of the offer letter was immediately doused by a cold, leaden dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. That evening, she showed David the email on her laptop screen, her hands trembling slightly. The silence in the room after he finished reading was thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. David's face, usually so open and expressive, became a careful, neutral mask as he processed the words. He was quiet for a long time just looking at the screen. "This is incredible, Elena," he finally said, his voice carefully measured. "You should be so proud. This is what you wanted." "It was what I wanted," she whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. Before they tried to talk about it logically like two rational adults, they sat at his small kitchen table and listed the pros and cons, their voices low and strained. He could not easily leave his job. His project was in a critical phase. She could not turn down this offer. It was a career-defining moment. The conversation went in circles, each loop tightening the knot of anxiety in Elena's chest. They were speaking different languages, the language of practical dreams clashing violently with the language of the heart. For the next few days, a strange polite distance grew between them. They were still together, still sharing meals in a bed, but a pane of invisible glass had slid into place. They were careful with their words, avoiding the giant, unspoken thing that loomed over them. The easy laughter was scarce, replaced by long, thoughtful silences. Elena felt like she was watching the colors of their beautiful life together begin to slowly drain away, fading to a worrisome gray. One afternoon, a week after the offer, David told her he had to work late. The excuse felt flimsy and a fresh wave of fear washed over Elena. Was this it? Was he pulling away because the problem was too big to solve? The hours dragged by. She tried to read, to watch a movie, to do anything to quiet the frantic beating of her heart, but it was useless. As evening deepened into night, her phone finally buzzed. It was a single text from David. "Can you meet me at the bookstore?" Now, confusion and a flicker of hope warded within her. Why the bookstore? She pulled on her jacket and hurried out into the cool night air, her footsteps quick and anxious on the pavement. The city was quieting down. The English Nook was dark, its closed sign facing the street, but the door was unlocked. Pushing it open, the familiar scent of old books and wood polish enveloped her. A single small lamp was lit on the main counter, casting a warm, intimate pool of light in the vast shadowy space. And there, standing in the very aisle where they had first met, was David. He looked nervous, His hands clenched tightly in front of him, but his eyes held a determined, unwavering light as they met hers. "David, what's going on?" Elena asked, her voice echoing slightly in the empty store. He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but soft. "I've been thinking about practical things and impossible things. And I realized I was thinking about it all wrong." He took a step toward her. "I was thinking about my career here and your career there. I was thinking about distance and visas and all the reasons why this couldn't work." He took another step, now close enough for her to see the deep emotion in his dark eyes. "And then I thought about coming home to an apartment that you weren't in. I thought about this city without your laugh in it. I thought about a future where I only got to see you through a screen." His voice wavered for the first time, and that future felt empty. It felt completely wrong. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Tears were already welling in her eyes, blurring his image. "I don't want a practical life, Elena," David said, his voice growing stronger, filled with a conviction that seemed to light up the entire dark bookstore. "I want a life with you." Then he slowly, deliberately got down on one knee right there on the worn wooden floor between the shelves of romance and adventure. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple, beautiful silver band with a single sparkling diamond. Elena brought her hands to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. "My home isn't in Seoul," David said, looking up at her, his love for her shining openly on his face. "It isn't an apartment or a city. My home is you, Elena. It's wherever you are. Please, let me come to Chicago with you. Let's build our home there together. Will you marry me?" The world stopped. All the fear, the anxiety, the impossible choice, it all shattered and fell away at his words. There was no decision to make anymore. There was only this man, this love, this forever he was offering. She breathed out the word. A joyful, tearful release. "Yes, David." 1,000 times. He slid the ring onto her finger, his own hands shaking. And then he stood pulling her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that held all the promise of their future. They stood there wrapped in each other in the quiet, holy space where their story had begun. The first page in this new, beautiful chapter forever linked. 1 year later, the view from their apartment window was of the glittering skyline of Chicago. A different constellation of city lights, but one that now felt just as much like home. The living room was warm and lived in, a harmonious blend of her things and his. A large canvas print of one of David's fantasy landscapes hung beside a framed vintage map of Seoul. On the couch under a soft knitted blanket, Elena sat with her feet tucked up, a well-loved book resting in her lap. David was beside her, a sketchbook balanced on his knees, his pencil moving swiftly across the page. He was drawing the scene before him. The cozy room, the city lights beyond the window, and most importantly, the woman beside him, the simple silver band on her finger catching the lamplight. "Remember when we thought it was impossible?" Elena said softly, not looking up from her book. David paused his sketching and looked over at her, a slow, deep smile spreading across his face. He reached out and laid his hand on her bare foot, his thumb making slow, comforting circles. "It was only impossible without you," he said simply. They had crossed an ocean for this. They had built a new life from the ground up, facing the challenges of a new country together. Their love the one constant, unshakable foundation. It had not been a fairy tale. It had been better. It had been real. It was in the way he made her coffee every morning just how she liked it, and the way she knew just when he needed a quiet walk to clear his head. It was in the way they still talked for hours, their dreams and fears now completely intertwined. Their love story wasn't about a single dramatic moment, but about the millions of tiny choices they made every single day to choose each other, to build a forever one patient loving moment at a time. And as they sat there together in the peaceful quiet of their own home, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, they both knew without a single doubt that their greatest adventure was only just beginning. If you enjoyed following Elena and David's journey from a chance meeting to a love that crossed oceans, be sure to subscribe for more unique and heartfelt romance stories. The morning light filtered through their Chicago apartment windows, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors that David had learned to navigate in the early hours before Elena woke. 6 months into their married life, he had developed a ritual of making coffee in near silence, sketching the way the sunlight caught in her hair as she slept, memorizing the peaceful expression that crossed her face in those unguarded moments. Marriage, he had discovered, was not the grand romantic gesture of the proposal or the magical day of the wedding. It was these quiet mornings, the way she hummed unconsciously while grading papers, the particular way she folded laundry that somehow made even mundane tasks feel sacred. But it was also harder than either of them had anticipated in ways that no one ever talked about. The adjustment period had been more intense than David had expected. Moving to Chicago meant starting over professionally in a city where he knew no one in the gaming industry. His portfolio was strong, but American companies wanted local experience, networking connections he didn't have, cultural references that sometimes went over his head in meetings. He had taken a temporary position at a small design firm downtown, creating marketing graphics for local businesses while he searched for something more aligned with his passion for game development. The work paid the bills, but left him feeling creatively starved, like he was slowly forgetting who he was as an artist. Elena tried to be supportive, but she was navigating her own challenges at the prestigious private school that had recruited her. The academic environment was more competitive than her previous job, with demanding parents and administrators who expected perfection. She came home most evenings emotionally drained, her characteristic warmth dimmed by stress and exhaustion. Some nights they sat at their small dining table, eating takeout in companionable but tired silence, both too depleted to maintain the easy conversation that had once flowed between them like water. The cultural differences that had seemed charming during their courtship in Seoul now sometimes felt like small daily obstacles. David missed specific foods, sounds, the particular energy of his home city. He found himself calling his family more frequently, speaking in rapid Korean while Elena sat nearby, understanding the emotion but not the words. She began to feel like an outsider in her own marriage during these conversations, watching David become animated in a way that English seemed to constrain. Elena had her own moments of homesickness, missing the version of herself she had been in Seoul, the woman who had felt brave and adventurous, who had fallen in love in bookstores and night markets. In Chicago, she was just another teacher in a demanding school system, living in a city where she had no shared memories with David, where their love story felt like something that had happened to other people in a different lifetime. The first serious fight came on a Tuesday evening in October. David had been turned down for another game design position, the third rejection in as many weeks. Elena found him at their kitchen table, staring at the polite but ultimately dismissive email on his laptop screen. "How was your day?" she asked gently, though his expression already gave her the answer. "They said my style wasn't quite what they were looking for," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "They were very complimentary about my technical skills." Elena sat down across from him, reaching for his hand. "I'm sorry. I know how much you wanted this one. Maybe we should consider expanding the search. There are other cities with strong gaming industries." David pulled his hand away, a gesture so small and yet so telling that Elena felt her stomach drop. "I can't keep starting over, Elena. I'm tired of being the foreign candidate, tired of having to prove I belong in every room I enter." His voice cracked slightly on the word tired, and Elena realized this was about more than job rejections. This was about identity, belonging, the slow erosion of confidence that comes from constant small rejections. "But we knew this would be challenging when we decided," Elena said, trying to keep her voice gentle. "We talked about the difficulties of starting fresh." "I know we did." His voice was sharper now, edged with frustration that had been building for months. "But knowing something intellectually and living it every day are completely different things. In Seoul, I was good at what I did. I had a reputation, connections, a career trajectory. Here, I'm just another immigrant artist hoping someone will take a chance on me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Elena felt a flash of defensiveness rise in her chest. "You're not just another anything, David. You're incredibly talented. And it's not like my transition has been easy either. This school is nothing like what I'm used to. I'm working 60-hour weeks just to keep up with their expectations." They stared at each other across the small table, both recognizing that they were no longer talking about jobs or cities, but about the fundamental question of whether their sacrifice had been worth it. Whether love, however deep and real, could sustain them through the practical challenges of building a life together. The argument that followed was quiet but devastating. Not the dramatic, shouting kind of fight that ends in passionate reconciliation, but the slow, careful dismantling of assumptions they had both held about their relationship. David admitted that he sometimes wondered if he had made the right choice, leaving behind everything familiar for a life that felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Elena confessed that she felt responsible for his unhappiness, guilty for being the reason he had uprooted his entire existence, resentful that his sacrifice sometimes felt like a weight she had to carry. They went to bed that night on opposite sides of their mattress, both staring at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if this was what the end of a marriage felt like. Not explosion, but a slow deflation, love leaking out through 1,000 small punctures until what remained was just two people who had once been happy together. The turning point came 3 weeks later in the most unexpected way. David was working late at the design firm, finishing a project for a local restaurant's rebrand, when his phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "There's a game development meetup happening downtown tonight. I know you're tired, but maybe just to network." He almost dismissed it, too emotionally exhausted for another evening of forced conversation and business card exchanges. But something in the careful way she had phrased the message made him reconsider. She was trying, extending an olive branch wrapped in practical advice. The meetup was in a converted warehouse space in River North, buzzing with energy David hadn't felt in months. Game developers, artists, programmers, and designers filled the industrial space, their conversations animated and passionate in a way that reminded him why he had chosen this career in the first place. He moved through the crowd tentatively at first, introducing himself with the careful politeness he had perfected over months of networking events. But then he encountered a group discussing the challenges of creating immersive fantasy worlds, their conversation rich with technical detail and creative passion. David found himself drawn in, his natural expertise overriding his self-consciousness. For the first time in months, he forgot to monitor his accent, forgot to second-guess his cultural references, forgot to be anything other than himself. When one of the developers mentioned struggling with a particular lighting technique that David had mastered years ago, he offered advice without hesitation. The conversation that followed was electric, the kind of creative collaboration that reminded him why he loved this work. By the end of the evening, he had exchanged contact information with several people, but more importantly, he had remembered who he was when he wasn't trying to translate himself for others. He arrived home close to midnight to find Elena waiting up on the couch, a mug of tea cooling in her hands and hope written carefully across her features. "How was it?" she asked, and David realized she had been nervous, that his answer mattered more than just curiosity. "It was good," he said, settling beside her. "Really good. I think I remembered something I had forgotten." "What's that?" "That I don't have to choose between being Korean and being successful here. I can be both." Elena leaned against his shoulder, and he felt some of the tension that had been living in his body for weeks begin to release. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "Maybe we've been trying so hard to build a life that looks like what we think it should be that we forgot to build the life that actually works for us." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe success doesn't have to look the same here as it did in Seoul. Maybe we get to define it for ourselves." David turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that he had missed in recent weeks. A determination that reminded him of the woman who had crossed an ocean for love. The next few months brought a shift in perspective that changed everything. Instead of waiting for opportunities to find him, David began creating them. He started a freelance practice, taking on game design projects remotely for companies around the world, including several in Seoul. His Chicago apartment became a hybrid studio space, filled with the familiar sounds of Korean conversations over video calls and the scratch of pencil on paper as he developed concepts that drew from both his Korean heritage and his American experience. Elena, meanwhile, began to approach her teaching position differently. Instead of trying to conform to the school's existing culture, she started incorporating innovative techniques she had learned during her time in Seoul. She proposed an exchange program with schools in South Korea, organized cultural education events, and slowly began to carve out a space where her international experience was seen as an asset rather than a curiosity. The change wasn't immediate or dramatic, but gradual, like a garden growing in time-lapse photography. Their conversations at dinner became animated again, filled with stories of small victories and creative breakthroughs. David would show Elena concept art that blended traditional Korean aesthetics with modern fantasy elements, explaining how his cultural duality had become a strength in his work rather than a complication. Elena shared stories of her students' excitement about learning Korean phrases, their curiosity about different educational approaches, the ways their classroom was becoming a bridge between worlds. Their physical intimacy returned too, not just the mechanics of sex, but the emotional nakedness that had characterized their early relationship. They made love with a desperate gratitude, like people who had almost lost something precious and couldn't quite believe they had found it again. Afterward, they would lie tangled in their sheets, planning future projects, dreaming aloud about the life they were building together. 1 year after their first major fight, Elena came home to find David sitting at his drafting table, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. He was working on a new game concept, but something about his posture suggested this was different from his usual projects. "What are you working on?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. "A love story," he said, not looking away from the screen. "About two people who meet in a bookstore in a foreign city, fall in love despite all the reasons it shouldn't work, and then have to figure out how to build a life together when the fairy tale part ends and the real work begins." Elena leaned forward to study the concept art on his screen. The characters were beautifully rendered, clearly inspired by their own story, but transformed into something universal. The game environment was a hybrid of Seoul and Chicago, fantasy and reality, East and West. "It looks complicated," she said. "The best kind of complicated," David replied, finally turning to face her. "Want to help me write it?" The game development became a project that consumed them both in the most wonderful way. Elena contributed to the narrative design, while David handled the visual and technical aspects. They worked side by side in their apartment, their collaboration intimate and intense, fueled by shared takeout and the particular energy that comes from creating something together. The process forced them to revisit their own story, to examine the moments of crisis and growth with the analytical distance of storytellers while still honoring the emotional truth of their experience. They laughed about David's early misconceptions about American dating culture, Elena's struggles with Seoul's public transportation system, the awkward dinner where she had tried to impress his parents by cooking Korean food and had accidentally used salt instead of sugar in the marinade. But they also talked honestly about the loneliness, the cultural disconnection, the way love had sometimes felt insufficient against the practical challenges of building a shared life across languages and continents. The game they created was unlike anything either of them had worked on before. It was deeply personal, yet universally resonant, a story about love that acknowledged both its transformative power and its limitations. Players would navigate not just physical challenges, but emotional ones, making choices about sacrifice and compromise, learning to balance individual dreams with shared goals. The character progression system was built around developing emotional intelligence, cultural competency, and the ability to communicate across differences. When they finished the initial demo, they submitted it to an independent gaming festival in Austin. Elena watched David hit the send button on their application, both of them holding their breath as if this moment would determine not just their professional futures, but the meaning of everything they had been through together. 3 months later, they received notification that their game had been selected not only for inclusion in the festival, but as a finalist for Best Narrative Design. The email arrived on a Thursday morning while they were eating breakfast, Elena grading papers, while David sketched new character concepts. They read the message together, Elena's hand finding David's across the table as the magnitude of their achievement began to sink in. "We did it," Elena whispered, and David realized she wasn't just talking about the game selection, but about everything. They had done it. They had survived the transition, the cultural adjustment, the professional setbacks, the moments when love had felt like an insufficient foundation for a shared life. They had built something beautiful together, not just a marriage, but a creative partnership that honored both their individual talents and their shared vision. The trip to Austin for the festival felt like a second honeymoon, but different from their actual honeymoon. This was a celebration not of potential, but of actualization, not of who they might become together, but of who they had proven themselves to be. They walked through the festival venues hand in hand, watching other people play their game, seeing strangers become emotionally invested in the story they had created together. The validation was intoxicating, but what mattered more was the way other developers responded to their work. Industry professionals approached them with collaboration proposals, publishing opportunities, invitations to speak at conferences about cross-cultural game design. David found himself in demand not despite his Korean background, but because of it, his cultural perspective seen as a valuable asset in an industry increasingly interested in global storytelling. Elena discovered that her educational background translated seamlessly into game narrative design, her understanding of character development and story structure making her a sought-after consultant for other development teams. They won the award. Standing on stage together, Elena in a midnight blue dress that made her look like a movie star and David in a suit that finally fit him perfectly, they accepted the recognition for their work with a grace that came from having earned it through struggle and perseverance. David's acceptance speech was brief but heartfelt, delivered in lightly accented English that he no longer tried to hide. He thanked Elena not just as his creative partner, but as the person who had taught him that love wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about choosing someone with whom you could build something greater than either of you could create alone. The audience responded with the kind of warm applause that suggested they understood they were witnessing something special, not just a professional achievement, but a love story that had transformed itself into art. Flying back to Chicago, Elena and David sat side by side in their airplane seats, each lost in their own thoughts, but connected by the shared understanding of how far they had traveled, not just geographically but emotionally. The city lights spread below them as they descended, no longer foreign but familiar, not the place where they had struggled to fit in, but the place where they had learned to create their own definitions of belonging. 2 years later, their game had been translated into 12 languages and had won several international awards. David's independent studio had grown to employ 6 people, a diverse team of developers from around the world who brought their own cultural perspectives to projects that celebrated rather than erased difference. Elena had taken a leave of absence from traditional teaching to focus on educational game development, creating learning experiences that helped students develop empathy and cross-cultural understanding. They had moved to a larger apartment with space for both their professional work and their personal lives. The walls were covered with concept art from their various projects, photographs from their travels, and mementos from the life they continued to build together. In the evenings, they still sat together on their couch, Elena reading while David sketched, but now their comfortable silences were full of shared accomplishment rather than exhausted depletion. On quiet Sunday mornings, David would make coffee in the same ritual he had developed during their difficult early months. But now when Elena woke to the smell of brewing beans and the sound of his pencil on paper, she found him sketching not her sleeping form, but new worlds they might build together, new stories they might tell, new ways their love could become something larger than itself. They had learned that love was not just about the moment of choosing each other, but about the daily decision to keep choosing, to keep growing, to keep creating something beautiful together even when the work was hard and the outcomes uncertain. Their love story had become more than romance. It had become a foundation for a life that honored both their individual dreams and their shared vision, a testament to the possibility of building a home not just in a place, but in the space between two people who refuse to stop reaching toward each other across whatever distances might separate them. And as they sat together in their Chicago apartment, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had built together, they both knew that their greatest adventure was not behind them, but still unfolding, one patient, loving, creative moment at a time. Subscribe for more stories of love that transforms not just hearts, but entire lives.